Welcome, class. Recently, Tera Blast was banned from Scarlet and Violet Overused, the main format for competitive singles. In this lecture, we'll be going over the winners and losers of this ban, as well as the overall impact on the metagame and implications for the future. I want to clarify that Tera itself is still legal. It is simply the move Tera Blast that has been banned. So while Pokemon can still use Tera to boost stab and non-stab moves, as well as change their type for defensive purposes, Pokemon can no longer gain coverage that they didn't already have. Many have found this move problematic on certain sweepers. Dragonite, in particular, commonly used Tera Blast Ghost, Fairy, Flying on top of many other sets, making it very difficult to predict and deal with. On April 26, 2026, Tera Blast was narrowly banned from Overused by a 61% majority. I'll briefly state my personal opinions on this ban at the end, but the primary purpose of this video is to provide an objective analysis on which Pokemon are most significantly impacted by this ban and how this will change the format. Let's get right into it, starting with the losers. The most prominent loser, although certainly not the hardest hit, is Dragonite. As I stated, Dragonite would often run Tera Blast Fairy, Flying, and Ghost. Not being able to use Tera Blast anymore is definitely a nerf, but Dragonite will undoubtedly remain an excellent Pokemon and Overused. Tera Blast was on around 25% of Dragonite, which is significant, but still, many successful sets don't use Tera Blast. Tera Normal Extreme Speed sets have been the most popular since the start of the generation, and now they'll be even more popular. But Tera Ground to boost Earthquake, Tera Fire to boost Fire Punch, and defensive Tera types still allow Dragonite to be a very threatening and diverse sweeper. It has fewer sets than before, making it easier to deal with, but it still has incredible set variety and will remain an amazing sweeper. Kyurem is the next most prominent loser. Dragon Dance sets would typically run Icicle Spear and Scale Shot with the loaded dice, and Tera Blast Fire, Ground, or Electric in the last slot. Tera Blast no longer being an option means Dragon Dance Kyurem can no longer hit Steel types really at all, unless they choose to run Earth Power. Kyurem doesn't get Earthquake or any other useful physical coverage for taking on Steels, so the losing Tera Blast is a massive nerf for these sets. Even if Kyurem chooses to run Earth Power, not only will they be forced to run mixed EVs, giving up bulk, speed, or attack, but Dragon Dance of course doesn't boost Earth Power, so it won't be nearly as effective at KOing Steels like Kingambit or Goldengo. This is definitely a massive blow to Dragon Dance Kyurem, and I expect the set's usage will be massively hit, maybe even fall into obscurity. Kyurem will be fine in general though, it still has extremely potent mixed attacking sets, substitute sets, and choice spec sets. Enamorus is next. Most sets are unimpacted, but Enamorus did use Tera Blast Stellar around 25% of the time. Tera Blast Stellar is terrible on most Pokemon since it lowers attack and special attack by one stage after being used, but on contrary Pokemon, this turns into a boost. Specs, Scarf, and some other Enamorus would use Tera Blast Stellar and try to snowball out of control. These sets are obviously completely eliminated, as the fundamental strategy behind them isn't legal. Enamorus will still be a solid Pokemon though, most Scarf and Spec sets didn't use Tera Blast Stellar anyway. The next major hit in the overused tier is Ironmoth. Ironmoth used Tera Blast somewhat frequently, about 12% of the time, usually Tera Blast Ground, Water, or Ghost to help get past walls like Heatran and Ceruledge. Not having this option hurts, but not too much. Ironmoth has a lot of great coverage without Tera, and it will remain a hyper-offense staple, offering great sweeping potential and solid defensive utility. Also, the Tera Blast ban really only affected booster energy sets, which, although is by far the most common item Ironmoth runs, Choice Specs and Heavy Duty Boot set almost never utilize Tera Blast. Next up to discuss is Dragapult. Dragapult didn't use Tera Blast often, but Choice Band and Dragon Dance sets used it almost all the time. Tera Blast Ghost was the most common, as Dragapult has no strong physical ghost stab, but Tera Blast Fire and Fighting were also seen on occasion. I would say that both of these sets will see less usage, but remain viable. Choice Band Dragapult's main strength is its speed and its amazing non-contact multi-hit Dragon Darts. Not being able to effectively hit Fairy types anymore is difficult, but with proper team building, physical Dragapult's shortfalls can be managed. Rillaboom was also hurt a little bit. Swords Dance sets would sometimes run Tera Blast Fire or Electric to help take down birds like Corviknight, Zapdos, and Moltres. Still, this isn't a big deal. Even most Swords Dance sets before opted to use Tera Dark Knockoff or Tera Grass to boost Grassy Glide and or Woodhammer. Choice band sets very rarely use Tera Blast and are generally unaffected, so Rillaboom usage and its place in the meta should remain quite stable. Now let's go over some more losers from lower tiers that are still relevant in Overused. Before we get into that, it should be noted that if I refer to usage stats, I'm discussing the data found on the Overused ladder, filtered to exclude players below 1500 Glicko. I'm using Munch stats for this, which I'll link in the description for those interested. So the next big loser is Galarian Moltres. This poor bird was hit harder than anything else we've discussed so far. It would typically run Nasty Plot, Agility, Fiery Wrath, and Tera Blast. It used Tera Blast nearly 60% of the time. Galarian Moltres is severely lacking in coverage. It really just has dark and flying moves. This isn't a great offensive combo when Kingambit, which is on about a quarter of teams, resists both. Tera Blast Fairy was the popular choice, giving Galarian Moltres an amazing offensive type combo and a great defensive type as well. Without Tera Blast, Galarian Moltres is in big trouble. It's always been a niche pick and Overused to begin with, but I suspect this will push it over the edge into unviable territory. It might still be possible to make it work, but it won't be nearly as reliable as before. Speaking of sweepers that rely on Tera Blast, the next big loss is for Polteageist. Polteageist is a mono ghost type, and it has dark, grass, and psychic coverage, so basically it hard loses to Kingambit, unless of course Tera Blast. It used Tera Blast over 60% of the time, mostly Tera Blast fighting to hit Kingambit and Ting Lu hard. This set was particularly popular with Indeedee on Psychic Terrain teams to avoid priority and boost Polteageist's stored power. Many teams would outright lose to this teapot, but those days are over. With Tera Blast gone, Polteageist has no way of getting past Kingambit and many other dark types. This is a huge blow to Polteageist and the Psychic Terrain archetype as a whole. I expect Polteageist will barely remain viable, probably using White Herb Strength Sap sets. The Focus Sash sets, though, I expect will be nearly completely eliminated by the loss of Tera Blast. Sandy Shocks also took a big L here. Both of its stabs have immunities, and very popular ones at that. Landorus and Gliscor are immune to both of Sandy Shock's stabs, and it has absolutely no coverage that's helpful for hitting these two. It would often rely on Tera Blast Ice, but of course, now it can't. Sandy Shocks may still have some limited viability as a hazard lead or hazard setting pivot. It does get both Spikes and Stealth Rock, but without Tera Blast, any Landorus or Gliscor can now switch into Sandy Shocks without fear. Probably Sandy Shocks will almost completely disappear from Overused. Speaking of disappearing from Overused, we are gathered here today to mourn the loss of Thunderous Therian. It used Tera Blast 55% of the time, but those numbers go up to nearly 70% if you just look at high ladder. To be an effective or consistent Pokemon, Thundurus really needed to use either Tera Blast Flying, Fairy, or Ice. With Tera Blast gone, Thundurus now has no way to use Special Flying Stab, and it is completely hardwalled by Gliscor and most of the Dragon types in the tier. I expect this will push Thundurus out of the viable zone, and we will hardly ever see it in the tier anymore. It may work on a few teams, but even that I doubt. Serperior is also in serious trouble. It relied heavily on Tera Blast to get past Steel types, often using Tera Blast Fire or Stellar, taking advantage of Contrary much like Enamorus did. It used Tera Blast 45% of the time, but if you look at higher ladder, that shoots up to 65%. All of the most consistent Serperior sets made use of Tera Blast. This loss will limit Serperior severely. I don't think it will be completely unviable. Contrary Leaf Storm is still great, and it has utility moves like Leech Seed, Glare, and Knockoff that are helpful. Choice Scarf sets are also very threatening against more offensive teams. Serperior usage will likely see a massive dip that will never recover, but it is probably still viable on some teams. Hisui and Lilligant also like to use Tera Blast, using it around 40% of the time. Tera Blast Fire and Ghost allowed it to get past a lot of typical walls, most notably Gholdengo, which resists its grass and fighting stabs. Lilligant will now have to use Triple Axle or Ice Spinner for coverage, or opt for utility moves like Encore or Healing Wish, making it less effective and consistent at breaking. It's generally only used on Sun teams, and I expect it will still see some usage in that role, but this loss of Tera Blast will likely make more Sun users pick a different kind of abuser, or fill the Chlorophyll slot with Venusaur instead, which almost never uses Tera Blast. Comfey is another Sun abuser that doesn't enjoy this ban. It uses Tera Blast about 30% of the time. Comfey only has Grass, Fairy, and Psychic coverage, so it's helpless against Steel types without Tera Blast. Still, I expect Comfey will still have a niche. The most successful Comfey team, a Sun team which hit rank 1, uses a growth set with Draining Kiss, Stored Power, and Synthesis, and a defensive Tera Water. With enough growths, even Steel types are dying to boost its stored power, and Comfey has the bulk to use some Steels as setup fodder with Tera Water. The loss of Tera Blast definitely makes Comfey easier to deal with, but I'm sure it still has a place in the tier. I can't say the same for Frostmoth. Despite not seeing much usage, Frostmoth is a terrifying Quiver Dance sweeper and overused, or at least it was. It only has Bug, Ice, Grass, Flying, and Fairy coverage. It's also a Bug and Ice type with poor physical defense. This is a recipe for losing to basically every single Steel type. It used Tera Blast about 70% of the time, usually ground or electric to beat Steels or even use them as setup fodder, but those days are over. Now your opponent can safely switch into nearly any Steel, resist every hit, and KO Frostmoth. I'd love to be proven wrong, but I think this is the end of Frostmoth's viability in overused. Now for the last overused relevant loser, it's Jolteon. A very niche pick, but proven to be quite effective. Jolteon would use Tera Blast about 30% of the time, almost always Tera Blast Ice. Jolteon's insane base 130 speed, paired with that Bolt Beam coverage, was very scary for a lot of teams. However, Jolteon will likely remain viable. The most successful Jolteon team that hit rank 1 on the ladder used Tera Fairy and Alluring Voice instead of Tera Blast Ice, proving this to be a viable option as well. Jolteon's small niche got even smaller, but it didn't disappear. Alright, that's it for the losers. Now let's discuss the winners. The obvious winners are the Pokemon that are once again legal in overused. Regieleki was banned due to its combination of insane speed, Volt Switch pivoting, and Tera Blast to hit ground types super effectively, typically Tera Blast Ice. Without Tera Blast, the threat is gone completely, and Regieleki really can't touch ground types at all. It was immediately dropped from Uber's, the overused ban list, back down to overused once Tera Blast was banned. Now, Regieleki will definitely not stay in overused. Even in Generation 8, when its ability Transistor provided a 1.5 times boost instead of the 1.3 times boost it is now, and when there were only 2 ground types in overused compared to the 5 we have now. So even under those much more favorable conditions, Regieleki was only at about 2% usage, well below the threshold needed to stay in the tier. With threats like Gliscor and Ting-Lu around, I expect Regieleki will be a very rare sight. I believe it will be viable in some capacity, likely as a dual screen setter and potentially as a removal, but it definitely won't dominate and it definitely won't get enough usage to remain in the tier. Volcarona hasn't been unbanned yet, but it is likely we'll see a suspect test soon, and I expect it to drop. Volcarona was considered problematic largely due to the combination of Quiver Dance and the coverage Tera Blast gave it, typically Tera Blast Ground, Dragon, or Water. Paired with Fire and Bug Stabs, this was nearly impossible to deal with. Without Tera Blast, it will still be a fearsome sweeper, but likely not broken enough to stay banned. I expect it will function much like it has in the past, a threatening if somewhat inconsistent sweeper in overused. It will also have some use as a defensive wall, I'm sure. Flame Body is, after all, a very valuable ability. Roaring Moon may drop as well. Not as likely as Volcarona, I'd say, but Tera Blast was at least a small factor in its ban. Tera Blast Fairy sets, in particular, were extremely difficult to deal with. I don't expect Roaring Moon will drop. I think it's too much with or without Tera Blast, and I expect most of the community will agree, but if it does end up dropping to overused, it will resume its former place as a terrifying Dragon Dance sweeper and a staple on Sun teams. Lastly, Espathra may drop as well. I would guess not, as this Pokemon is strictly just a speed boost combined stored power sweeper, and it really doesn't add much to the tier. But it did frequently use Tera Blast fighting when it was legal, mostly to hit Kingambit. Espathra does have Dazzling Gleam to hit Dark types though, and I expect this is enough to keep it in Ubers, but if it does drop, it will function much like it did before. A very scary and very inconsistent sweeper that will either do nothing or completely steamroll. Now, as far as winners that are already in the tier, the biggest winner is Gliscor. Obviously, Gliscor never uses Tera Blast, but the bigger deal is that so many Pokemon ran Tera Blast Ice just to kill Gliscor with that surprise 4-time super effective hit. Ice coverage isn't super rare, but it's not common either, and lots of Pokemon desperately want Gliscor dead. So seeing Tera Blast Ice on something random was surprisingly common, especially when it also hits Pokemon like Landorus and Garchomp. These two also benefit from Tera Blast Ice being eliminated, but not quite as much as Gliscor. Landorus and Garchomp don't nearly have the longevity of Gliscor, so it's less likely that the opponent would burn their Tera to take these two out. Landorus also used Tera Blast Flying and Ice on Choice Scarf and Choice Band sets, so it doesn't appreciate losing that. It's hard to say if this was a net positive for Landorus or not. Anyway though, back to discussing clear winners, the next is Kingambit. This Pokemon is everywhere. As I said, it's on nearly a quarter of teams, so many Pokemon that struggle with Kingambit normally would run Tera Blast to KO it, usually Tera Blast Fighting or Fire. Kingambit is now free to enjoy its amazing Dark Steel typing without worrying about a random 4x super effective Tera Blast Fighting. Kingambit did lose its Tera Blast Fairy sets, but this was only used on about 6% of Kingambit. Overall, I'd say this is a net positive for sure. Corviknight is a winner for a similar reason as Kingambit. Several Pokemon would use Tera Blast to get past Corviknight, most commonly Tera Blast Fire. Not as big a target as Kingambit, but it will definitely appreciate the removal of surprise coverage. Lastly, Zamazenta is a substantial winner as well. Tera Blast Fairy was used on a ton of sweepers like Dragonite, Kingambit, Galarian Moltres, Hydreigon, and Darkrai, just to name a few. Zamazenta no longer has to worry about this, which is definitely nice. It should be noted that of these winners that are in the tier, none of these are huge winners. Even Gliscor, which I'd consider the biggest winner, wasn't getting hit with Tera Blast Ice all that often. Gliscor, Kingambit, Corviknight, and Zamazenta aren't about to experience a massive boost in usage or anything like that. They'll probably just get very slightly better. The Tera Blast ban caused some major nerfs and practically eliminated some Pokemon from the tier, but it didn't provide any substantial buffs, unless you count Regieleki and potentially Volcarona becoming legal again as a buff. I should also note that we may see other winners emerge due to subtle metagame shifts. For example, perhaps the nerfs to Dragonite and Kyurem will boost the usage of Tornadus Therian or Ogerpon. These metagame shifts are difficult to predict, but we may see some unexpected winners emerge. In this case, though, I don't expect we will. The Pokemon most severely hit by the Tera Blast ban were all quite niche, low-tier picks that didn't have much usage and overused. They weren't metagame defining at all. And while Dragonite and Kyurem were certainly nerfed, they'll still get plenty of usage. Overall, the Tera Blast ban likely won't change the metagame much at all. The tier will be extremely similar to how it was, unless the Tera Blast ban leads to Volcarona and or Roaring Moon becoming part of the tier again. Now, as I said, this video is primarily meant to be an objective piece, but for those wondering, I will now briefly state my personal opinion. I'm not happy with this ban. It eliminated or severely hurt a lot of Pokemon that I think are very cool, really all for the sake of slightly nerfing Dragonite and Kyurem. These two were really the only problematic users of Tera Blast, so it feels very silly to ban Tera Blast instead of just banning these two. Now, Kyurem has already been suspect tested twice, so targeting it again would be a bit undemocratic, but we certainly could have gone after Dragonite. I also don't think this video truly shows how many lower tier options were hurt by the ban of Tera Blast. I mentioned those that were most relevant to overuse and had already proven themselves in the metagame, but there were tons of low tiers I wanted to build around that I thought had potential, that relied on or really liked Tera Blast. Porygon Z could use Tera Blast for a strong normal stab that could turn into a fighting or fairy attack if needed. Farigiraf used Tera Blast in a similar way. Cryogonal was a really fun rapid spinner, but really needed Tera Blast Fire to have any chance at functioning. Choice Band Houndstone was actually a really solid Sand Rush user, but it often wanted Tera Blast Ghost, so it wouldn't have to rely on Poltergeist, which is blocked by Pokemon with consumed items. There are many more examples, but I won't keep going as I wanted to keep this segment short. I will say though, on a more positive note, sometimes when options are removed, it allows other creative options to flourish. Perhaps the removal of Tera Blast will see some low tiers with good coverage options gain viability, when before they would have been outclassed by a Tera Blast user. I very much doubt this will outweigh the massive list of low tiers that were effectively killed by the Tera Blast ban, but I may be wrong and I certainly hope I'm wrong. And hey, at least we have Regieleki back. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing and leaving a like, it helps out a lot. Also, let me know in the comments what you think of the Tera Blast ban. Do you support it, and why or why not? Well, that's all for today. Class dismissed.